Welcome to the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning podcast. I am your host, Dr. Ouida McAfee, and today our guest is Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola, and we're going to be talking about storytelling. Welcome, Dr. Cola.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to talk about something I truly love doing.
And we are so glad to have you. So speaking of storytelling, will you please tell us about yourself in a story?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, the first story that popped in my head when you asked me to introduce myself was a story that I had with my father. So, my puppy, like as I call him. And so one summer I didn't quite get out applications quick enough. This was when I was in college. I to be able to get jobs, and so I ended up working at a factory. I started working at a factory that summer, and my dad works in a factory. He's worked in a factory, his whole life. He's from or not his whole life, but for several years at that time. And so he was used to kind of the factory thing, and I kind of sort of by association understood kind of what being in a factory was like. And so I ended up working in the factory, and we would come home about the same time. So my puppy is from he's Chicano, he's from Texas, or Tejano. Was born in Texas, raised a bit in Mexico, and then when his mother passed away, he found out he was a citizen. He didn't know he was born in the States, and so he came on, back over and stayed there. And so he worked in different migrant farming in communities around the country until he landed in Michigan, where we lived, where I grew up, and where he started working at that factory. And so every time he would come home, from the factory, he would kind of wash the factory off of him. He'd take a shower immediately because he just wanted to wash the factory off of him. Me, on the other hand, I came in and I just was like, messy and didn't care. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of walking around and in my factory funk, I guess is the best way to describe it. And my dad, after a shower one day, calls me into the living room, and he said, "Mija," which is a term of endearment. My daughter literally is what it means, but it's a term of endearment. "Mija, come here for a second, please." And I said, "Okay, puppy." And so I walked over to the living room with him, and he said, "Look at my hands." And he showed me his hands, and he has worker hands. They're calloused. His hands tell a story in and of themselves of a man who has worked very hard his entire life. He said, "Now show me yours." And I, of course, showed him my, college hands that have, the toughest thing I've had to carry is a pencil, so to speak, or my book bag, at the time. And he told me, he showed me his hands, and he says, "Mija, I work this hard so you don't have to. Please, please find an office job if you can. I don't want you working in a factory." And I, of course, started crying, and I'm like, "Okay, puppy, I will, I promise," and the next day I applied to sort of an internship position at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which is in my hometown of Battle Creek, Michigan, and I got the job. And so almost immediately, I left, and when I told the factory, I was trying to give a standard 2 weeks. They were like, "Girl, get out of here. We knew you didn't belong in here anyway," sort of a thing. And so I ended up working at the Kellogg Foundations, and I share that story because I think I wanted to demonstrate sort of the working class background that I've come from, the immigrant background that I come from, and I'm also the first in my family to go to college. So to have my dad tell me something like that was very meaningful to me at the time, and still is, and I still carry that with me. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much for sharing. Now I have so many questions
Yes.
that I want to ask you about personally.
Yes.
And so that's part of the beauty of storytelling that I can see, to want to know more about each other. So thank you for sharing it again.
Sure.
So, what are some other examples? What are some examples of storytelling that can be used in the classroom?
I think that, we interact with, the world in so many different ways, and I think that remembering sort of the critical moments in our development, in the development of our thinking, you know, um, is a way to be able to kind of talk about that and prompting students and helping them to realize that their memories, are, you know, um, something that can be studied, something that there are people that, I mean, I think they're so used to calling it anecdotal evidence, right? That's the way they dismiss much of the stories that many people of color share by calling it anecdotal evidence. And I was like, yeah, well, but if you were interviewing me, it'd be data, and so I think that's one of the things that I encourage my students to talk about is that, their lives, in a sense, are evidence, of their lived reality. Their lived experience is something that is valuable, to be able to do that. And I think that being able to bring their themselves into the classroom in some meaningful way, I think would be, something that's important.
Okay, so would that be done through a discussion question or?
Yeah, definitely. You can, do them through discussion questions to kind of get the students talking about it, to, sharing stories amongst themselves, or just, it can be in an assignment prompt, share a story about a time that you encountered XYZ, and be as detailed as you possibly can, in that. And so then what's really nice is that the more detailed they get, and you also ask them what images come to mind when you're thinking about this, and so that if they create, let's say, a digital storytelling project, right,
Mhm.
they can be able to create almost like a storyboard in their mind of what their story is, and then turn that into the digital storytelling, using like iMovie or something else like that. Um, I use a lot of clip art, simple clip art for mine, and if I were to retell the story visually rather, my father's story, I would have clip arts of factories, clip arts of hands, and those kinds of things that I think to kind of help tell the story further.
Okay, so how does that translate into skills and outputs across different courses?
Absolutely. One of the things that, it's a really great question. One of the things that I think it helps students do is to be able to um, learn to plan out what they're going to say, you know what I mean, or what they're going to write. It helps them sort of, especially if they're kind of have different style learning styles to be able to do things, so that quote unquote boring, paper that you need to write in X class, can actually become more alive if you start to think of it in terms of a story, if you start to think of it in terms of something visual in your head. And I think that it makes it easier for the student to be able to write those things, because it's practice really, because the more they get to write the familiar, then they'll become better with writing the unfamiliar.
Okay. So in preparing for the podcast today, I know you had mentioned digital storytelling and CRT. What is CRT?
Yes. So CRT is a critical race theory, which is, of course, really big right now, really, you know, um, controversial, around the country right now, and deeply, deeply misunderstood, and I think I went to law school, and so my understanding of it has always been rooted in law, and the research that I do is based on school desegregation cases, that those are stories in and of themselves, right? And so what CRT does, there's several tenets to it. That's one of the things that I always find really funny, when people talk about it, is they don't realize that there's actually, components to it. And one of the components to it is something called counter narratives, or sometimes they call it storytelling. And what it is that there's a master narrative that's out there, right, about what the history in the US is. And what CRT offers are counter narratives to that, saying, yes, this is what you know is the big story, but there's other stories within that story that counter that narrative, and so many times our experiences as people of color are living counter narratives to what's out there all the time. And so, when you root storytelling in this notion of counter narratives, I think that it'll help students sort of like, oh, okay, I get that, that there is another story to be told here, and it doesn't even have to be over the dominant, sort of white, whitewashed or white kind of dominant storyline. It can be even storylines that we have amongst ourselves as people of color. One of the big stories for myself that you hear is of course, Brown versus Board of Education, and it's an important story and it's a special story. And there are also other stories that help contribute to that and make it stronger that involve, Latine, Mexican American, Chinese American, and Native American plaintiffs as well. And knowing those stories enhance the story. So it's not completely a counter narrative, but it's adding a story to the story to make it stronger, if that makes any sense.
Yes. So thank you.
Yeah.
How do you help your peers become comfortable with storytelling?
One of the things that there used to be this talk of creating a safe space, right, in classrooms.
Mhm.
That was the talk for a really long time. But then there was a transformation to calling for what they call brave spaces,
Mhm.
in the classroom, because safe space was all about the professor trying to create a safe space for students, for them, but also, not realizing that, and it also needs to be a safe space for them as well,
Mhm.
but in order to do that, they have to be brave, right?
Mhm.
And share from their own experiences, and being vulnerable like that with students can be really challenging, but I think that it shows the students a part of your humanity, to be able to share those stories. But it requires a great deal of vulnerability. And so I always encourage people, share simple stories first, and then the stories can get deeper. The more you start to get comfortable sharing the simple ones, then they eventually start to get deep, to the point that, they become more personal, and the more personal it become, the more of a rapport you build with your students, and that if you're willing to be, open and vulnerable about your own life, they're going to be open and vulnerable about theirs.
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
What responses have you received from students on some of the assignments?
Some of the assignments, most of the students really like it. They like the exercise of it. Some students have like used GoPro, and they I remember one student sort of took one of those little bike things, those like skateboard looking things that have a handle on them, and like did a tour of, his life, like a day in the life of, kind of thing, using a GoPro. That I thought was really interesting. Many students say, I hadn't never thought of things my favorite thing to hear students say is, I never thought of things like that, or I never thought, that was a connection to make. And for them to sort of, for me in particular with sociology, to see the sociology in their lives. I always tell my intro students, you're going to hate me at the end of this class, because once you start to see sociology, you're never going to stop seeing it. After that, you're going to see it in movies and cartoons, and the biggest thing I think is how important it is to see it in their lives. That's making that's awakening what is called their sociological imagination. And so, yeah, several students have responded very positively to the ability to do that. They also, it's interesting. Some of them are starting to use AI. There's one student that did a digital storytelling project. Did a digital storytelling for my criminology class, telling the story of Pablo Escobar. So it wasn't even his story. It was a totally different story about, Pablo Escobar, and used AI to create a narrator's voice, so put in the text for it, but have created this really deep sort of, impressive narrator voice that you hear in like real documentaries, so to speak, and so, there's some students have kind of been able to create mini documentaries, as a result as well. So, yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. No, the students, they're so creative, and they're gonna, they always impress me with sort of taking it to the next level. Like I said, I started with just simple clip art, and the students are showing me some really, really cool things that they're able to do, incorporating music in it. One of the things that I'm hoping to do with I teach a social inequality class, and I root it around Nina Simone, and their final papers are a playlist of a social inequality that they're studying, and it's music that makes them think of that social inequality, and I was thinking, recently, I said, I wonder if I should turn that into a digital project too, and let them be able to take lines from the song and take time to kind of explain it, and so that's another, kind of way that I was like, maybe that'll be more interesting to them than, I'll give it, I always give it to them as an option. I never make students do it because there's some students that are just better at writing and all they want to do is write. But I always give the option of digital storytelling.
We are talking with Dr. Cola and
Martinez-Cola, yeah.
Martinez-Cola. Thank you.
Mhm.
And it has just been a pleasure, and we can go on and on with it. I'd like to end with some final comments. What would you like to leave the audience with?
I think that one of the wonderful things about storytelling in the classroom period is it really and giving students that option to be able to do so, it really, really helps. We're getting an increasingly neurodivergent group of students that are coming through our classrooms, and this really truly helps in that capacity as well, with really being able to, you know, reach different learning styles, and if we sit and think about it, even for ourselves, we, as professors learn differently too. I mean, I'm an audiovisual learner, that's one of the reasons why I turn on the captions, for all the movies that I watch, because I need to see them both simultaneously to help me really understand what's going on with the movie, and so realizing that, we're not that different from our students. I think sometimes with the power dynamic that's involved, we forget, how rich our stories and experiences can help students really understand their own experiences and ultimately realize they're not alone. I recently, lost my husband this past year, and I'm actually approaching the anniversary of it. And I've been very open with my students about grief, and this is what grief looks like, and it's been a really, telling them stories about Greg, my husband, being able to share those and that's been able to have them connect with me in a way that, I didn't connect with my students before, especially if they've experienced a loss as well. So just, I think things like that, just, it requires a lot of bravery, and it's not for everybody. If you're, the standoffish type and the closed off type, this is not for you, necessarily. I mean, you can still encourage students to do their own storytelling, but they're more so encouraged when you can share from yourself as well.
What a gift. Thank you so much, Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola.
Yes.
You've been awesome, and we'll have you back again. Hopefully you'll come back.
Awesome. I would love that. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for having me. I really super appreciate it.
Thank you.